Wonderful. Thank you for joining us here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Cons. Always happy to talk about Skillpod.
Well, let's talk about you first. How about you? Could you share a little bit with us about your background?
Yeah, so I've been working in education since I was 21. I'm now 71, so 50 years. 40 of that in schools, and the last 10 or so working on Leica and Skillpod and sort of related things to that. So the years in independent schools were almost all spent in independent schools. And I was for 24 years in Hamilton at Hillfield, and then at Upper Canada College in Toronto, and then finally at UTS where I was principal, and from which I retired after 5 years in 2011. And since then, mostly not-for-profit work. I've been very active in the Canadian Association for Independent Schools. I chaired their evaluation council, which was a national committee that looked at accrediting its members. And also chaired the governance committee and was secretary of the board for the YW in Muskoka.
Let's jump into the PLP.
Okay.
How would you describe your learning preferences?
I'm definitely a 2 moving to a 4. And it really depends on what I'm doing. I both have that take it from the street kind of preference. I want to learn from people. I start at the concrete, but I love the abstract, but I don't get to the abstract very easily unless I go through the concrete. Like I have to have those concrete reasons for doing what I'm doing in order to get to a more abstract form. And I'm just depending on what I'm working on. Right now, Barry and I are working with a group of people called RAMP, which is a Residents Coalition Against Poverty in Muskoka. So I'm finding I'm more and more spending my time thinking about what is the big picture here, what could this become. So it really depends what I'm doing. But if I just have to sit down and learn something, I'm a 2, definitely.
Well, I'm glad there are lots of 2s around because I am not a 2.
There are lots of teacher 2s, that's for sure.
How would you identify your skill strengths?
Well, I think my strongest is, and it's just because I've used it most consistently over 50 years of a career, is the communication one. Good teaching depends on good communication with kids as much as it does on really loving the kids and loving the content that you're working with. And I think the thing I've learned from teaching that is my greatest strength is I'm a very good listener. And that has saved my bacon so many times in my life, I can't tell you. Just because I tend, in many cases, to sit back and listen to the conversation before I figure out. This is especially true when I'm working with someone who works for me. Sitting back and waiting until you're fairly confident you've got a picture of where that person is so much better. I learned to my dismay by not doing this in the early years. It's so much better if you want to get where you're gonna, to get where you want to go. So I would say it's listening, and I would say the most important thing about it is ultimately it is the communication skill that is going to enable you to accomplish what you really want to do.
So if we can just take a little sidetrack from that at the moment, because one thing that you said is very interesting, where you said that communication was a skill that you worked the most on over the course of your career. Do you think that people can build these skills, or are people naturally gifted in these skills?
No, I don't believe people, well, I guess there's some degree of natural gift, like there's some degree of proclivity. You tend to gravitate to the skills that you already feel you're going to be accomplished at, but communication is a learned skill. And I have to say, when I'm communicating with people, I'm still learning every single day. I am still saying to myself, don't jump yet, or listen to what this person is saying, or now it's time to reframe, so I will stop the person and say, okay, this is what I heard you say, just to make sure I'm on the right track. And I'm still consciously doing that. Like, it's never like driving a car. I am still doing it.
All right, so let's talk now about how you applied these, or maybe different skills during your career. Is there something you can share with us about a big challenge that maybe resulted in not such a great outcome? What we call learning from failure.
Okay, so I would say professionally, I think most people would answer this question by thinking immediately of their personal relationships, because that's where we experience most of the failure. But we all have these professional failures. Mine really was failing to get the job for which I might say I was eminently experienced and qualified, but failing to get it. And seeing somebody put in that job that I thought was not as good a candidate as I was. So that it was very tough, because I had a big emotional tie to the job. I had a lot riding on the job. It was a very good lesson in lowering your expectations, I would say, which I certainly took with me for the next years. And I think what I learned from it, aside from how not to get bitter, which is a pretty good lesson.
That's a very good lesson.
I think what I learned from it was that, number one, it was probably the timing was right for me to be moving on to something totally different anyway. And that I probably had conveyed in some way the fact that my feet were turning toward the door, and that I should listen to I knew that deep down. Even though I wanted the job, I knew it was really time to move on. So I think I learned a lot about listening to those deeper messages we get from ourselves. We all get those. And I learned a lot professionally just about how to line things up. So if you really want something, it goes back to our strategic communicating skills.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want something, you have to be pretty bloodless about setting up the message, setting up the context, setting up the outcome, and working backward from that outcome to get to what you want. So I think bottom line, although I wanted it, I didn't want it badly enough, because after I had gone through it, I could certainly see where the things were, both in communication and strategic planning. I could see I could have done a better job. So that was a good lesson.
Well, I like what you said too, that when we're talking about communication and listening, it's not just about listening to other people, but it's about listening to yourself as well.
Hardest thing to do. Hardest thing, because mostly those subterranean messages that we get, we don't want to receive those messages.
Squish.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And so one of my tips, which I'll talk about later if I get a chance, but it would be that whole thing about what am I really hearing, both from myself and from the context I'm in.
Well, let's talk about a more positive experience. What was a challenge? Can you share with us a challenge that you didn't know for sure that you could really take on, and that you did, and that it was a success?
Yeah.
And maybe what skills helped push you through that difficult challenge?
So it was really my final professional gig as principal. And I have to say, taking on the school I took on, even the people who were happiest for me had one question, and that was, "Are you sure?" And the reason for that was the school had really been the victim of a lot of unfortunate things, a relationship with the university that had gone sour, some bad personnel decisions, a pretty antagonistic union situation. There were just a whole series of things, not to mention
And you
financial
said,
issues.
yes, I want this one.
I want this. And a building that was, charming but decrepit, So, yeah, I did want it because, to me, it was the best school in Canada. It was by far the best academic school in Canada, in spite of, or sometimes Barry says because of, all these other warts that it had.
Right.
And I think two things were really important to my success there, and I was very successful in doing what needed to be done, which was what I needed to do was calm down the staff so they could perform, because they'd been left rattled by a succession of principals, and they were feeling very insecure, and their recent move to a union situation had created a lot of aggression among them. And the university was not being a very helpful partner. So I had to have a strategy for that. I had to, there were a lot of, and I was doing a lot of communicating. So I think the two things I had going for me were that I'm naturally diplomatic, and I've really worked at that over a long period of time. And I had just completed a very program at OISE in conflict resolution, which I found unbelievably helpful in communicating with people. Conflict resolution is negotiating, mediating, all of that is all about being able to find common ground. And so those were the things that really helped me out a lot. I was absolutely dedicated to the outcome that I wanted. I knew I had 5 years, so I had a limited time frame. And you know what? When you have a limited time frame and you're exiting the profession anyway, you can do anything. I mean, it's really true. Like, you have nothing to lose, literally. Yeah. Nobody's going to fire you in those 5 years because they're still hoping you're going to get it done. And so you wind up assessing risk in quite a different way. And you wind up taking risk in a much better way because you probably have around you other people who are equally dedicated to the positive outcome you're trying to get to. So those were the things I think that made me successful. I knew how to take the risks. I had huge amount of support. I was diplomatic. I wanted to succeed, and I knew about conflict resolution. And those were all incredibly valuable.
And would you describe yourself as a natural risk taker?
I would describe myself as brave, but conservative. So like I really have played by the rules in most of the aspects of my life. So, and I'm not a gambler. Like, I don't like things that are, I don't like to gamble. If you want to see me, like, my definition of hell is it's a gambling casino. Like Las Vegas.
On every level.
Las Vegas is my definition of hell. Absolutely. So no, I would not call myself a risk taker, but I'm a good analyst and I'm pretty brave. And so I do understand that it's important to take risks, and I understand for me what has to be in place for me to be comfortable with that. So yeah, so I would say I'm on the conservative edge of risk taking for sure.
But you get the job done.
Yeah, well, I'm very dedicated to completion and success. Like that really cranks up my engine. I really like to finish stuff and do it well.
If you can provide us with three concrete tips that you can share with anybody who's watching these videos for how they could improve their communication skills.
Okay, so my first one would be have respect for the people you're communicating with. And I just think it's so important to start from the premise that the people you're communicating with do not want to fail at what they're doing. And so, you know, regardless of any bad behavior or anything else, you have to be respectful. And secondly, you really have to have some kind of common ground. either there's a thing you want to accomplish. I'm not a big believer in trying to persuade people. I think people make up their own minds. But I am a big believer in the fact that if there's a good outcome to be had, it can be good for everybody. And so I think that's my second piece. Find the common ground. There's a great, when you do your mediation training, there's a great anecdote they always tell, and lots of people listening to this will be familiar with it. And it has to do with, if you've got a bunch of oranges and you don't know how to split them up, find the people who want to make orange juice and pair them with the people who want to make marmalade from the skins, and everybody will benefit. They don't have to each take half. They can each take the portion of it that they need to have. And I mean, I do think good communication is like that. So be respectful, find common ground. And of course, my last one is listen. You cannot do enough listening. If I had to give 3 tips all over again, I'd probably say listen, and then listen. And in the middle, I might say reframe. Always take the time to say to somebody, here's what I'm hearing you say. Have I got it right? You don't have to say it that baldly, but basically it's like your check that you're really hearing them. And if you respect what they're saying and you're focused on the common ground, you'll probably get the outcome you want.
Those are very good tips, and I think that people will really be happy to hear about those. Thank you for joining us here today. Really
Okay,
appreciate it.
Thanks, Cons. Really enjoyed it.
Okay. Bye.